incarceration rate for Indigenous people is getting worse year after year after year.
Tonight, Indigenous incarceration rates reach new historic highs.
We need a whole-of-government approach to move forward on all of those issues.
And we're joined by 4 Liberal ministers to discuss urgent Indigenous issues. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen. The Correctional Investigator of Canada is calling it a terrible historical milestone. Ivan Zinger issued a statement on Tuesday, and as Jamie Pashagumskim reports, the percentage of Indigenous people in federal prisons has reached an all-time high.
Just 4 years ago, Ivan Zinger reported that a quarter of people in federal prisons were Indigenous. Now, that number has gone up to 30%, while Indigenous people only account for 5% of Canadians. Zinger says Canada's efforts to curb overrepresentation are not working.
Despite all sorts of different governments, different royal commission inquiries, involvement of the courts, the incarceration rate for Indigenous people is getting worse year after year after year.
Jane Dixon is a professor at Carleton University's Faculty of Law. Dixon says Canadians need to wake up to the realities that Indigenous communities face.
Non-Indigenous Canadians owe a remarkable debt to Indigenous peoples across this country, and evidence of the non-payment of that debt is seen very clearly in the fact that Indigenous women now comprise 43% federally sentenced women in this country, Indigenous men over 30%. The numbers are even worse in provincial and territorial institutions, and they're very, very disturbing with regard to Indigenous youth.
Public Safety Minister Bill Blair issued a statement claiming his department has taken steps to address the overpopulation of Indigenous people in prisons. They said, these measures include investing $120 million to support the reintegration of previously incarcerated Indigenous people and advance restorative justice approaches, expanding the capacity of existing healing lodges, and opening a new one in Winnipeg. At the same time, we know there's much more work to do. Zinger said Indigenous rates could climb to 33% in the next 3 years. He says Indigenous people serve longer sentences, and Correction Services Canada needs to work with Indigenous offenders so they will be eligible for earlier parole. Jamie Pashagumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Some breaking news now. The Métis Nation of Ontario has been suspended by the Métis National Council. The suspension follows a probation period for the MNO who were accused of granting citizenship to people living in Eastern Ontario that the MNC says are not part of the Métis Nation. The suspension also comes on the heels of a historic tripartite meeting between the Métis Nations of Ontario, Saskatchewan and Alberta, who passed a resolution calling for more transparency and accountability from the Métis National Council. We'll have more on these developments tomorrow. The holding pattern continues between the Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs, the company that's building a pipeline through their territory, and the RCMP. APTN News has been on the ground in the area for the last week, and here's Tamara Pimentel with an update.
So we have been here in the Houston area for almost a week now, keeping an eye on the situations happening here on the Morris River Forest Road. As you can see behind me, the RCMP exclusion zone is still set up. There's about 2 vehicles parked there, keeping an eye on who enters the area. But so far we haven't been able to access the Gidimt'en and Unistoten camps. 39 kilometers down the road past this exclusion zone, the road hasn't been plowed and there is still fallen trees blocking the road, so we would have to hike about 4 kilometers down the road, then get picked up by someone from the camp. So we've been in contact with hereditary chiefs, and they are giving us permission to access the camp. But the media spokesperson for the camp tells APTN that the Gidimt'en camp is not media friendly and that there is no way to organize transportation to the camps. And in the past, Premier Horgan had declined a face-to-face meeting with hereditary chiefs, but tomorrow we'll be sending Minister of Indigenous Relations Scott Fraser to meet with Wet'suwet'en chiefs tomorrow. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News on Wet'suwet'en territory.
Thanks for that, Tamara. We want to hear what you think. Here's how you can continue the conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca. You can find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. You can also follow APTN News on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more Indigenous news. It's been just over a month since a trip to a Vancouver bank for a grandfather and his 12-year-old granddaughter ended with them in handcuffs. Maxwell Johnson only wanted to open a bank account for the child. The fallout was swift. Numerous support rallies were held, and the Bank of Montreal apologized. APTN's Tina House sat down with Maxwell Johnson to get their side of the story.
For Maxwell Sr. and his 12-year-old granddaughter, Tori, it's been an emotional roller coaster ever since that fateful day on December the 20th, 2019. They went to this Bank of Montreal branch to open Tori her first bank account. Although Max has been banking here for 7 years and has used his status card in the past with no problem. The bank employee they met with said there was inconsistencies on their status cards.
She said, sorry, but at this time we can't issue a card for your granddaughter right now. She said, come upstairs and you guys will get your status cards back. So we went upstairs, we waited around for probably about half an hour, and my granddaughter seen 2 Vancouver police officers walking towards us, or walked in, and she said, Papa, one of these guys are for us. I kind of laughed and I said, I don't think so. And sure enough, they came over, grabbed Tori and myself, walked us outside, turned us around, handcuffed us, told us we weren't under arrest but we were detained, and then they read us our rights.
Max says the situation was humiliating as dozens of people walked by and stared at them both while the officers questioned them separately.
She was crying, she was scared. Not being able to talk to her was the hardest part, and the worst part was seeing her in cuffs and both of us not knowing what was going on. And later on, then we found out they had issues with her status card and mine at the time. And later, we found by one of the officers, we found out they were told that we were doing a fraud scam on them.
The 2 officers did apologize after detaining them and let them go after they determined there was no fraud.
They apologized to us. Nobody from the bank would. And the officer that handcuffed her, I said, you better apologize to my granddaughter. She told me you were really rough with her. So he went over and talked to her and said he was really sorry. He didn't mean to be rough if he was rough.
Bank of Montreal executive Erminia Johansson had this to say about the incident.
Calling the police department, we set off a series of events. And for that, we're embarrassed, we're apologetic, we want to meet and have a conversation with Mr. Johnson, his granddaughter, and anyone else in the family that's related and connected, to be able to say that in person.
Erminia Johansson would not clarify if the employee was fired, but when asked if it was a policy to phone police,
it is not our policy to phone the police department.
Maxwell suffers from panic disorders and anxiety. He says he was doing well before this happened, but now it's back with a vengeance. He takes medication and uses this stress ball to help him cope. Both are in counseling, but this will have a long-term impact. BMO did call them shortly afterward to apologize.
I said, there's nothing you guys can do. I told her, I said, the damage is already done. I said, my granddaughters can be scarred for life. And my son had to watch his dad and his niece get handcuffed. So I just want to keep a distance from them right now.
Max hasn't decided if he will close his account with them, but he has retained legal counsel and is considering all options. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Liberal cabinet ministers have wrapped up a 3-day retreat here in Winnipeg. When we come back, we sit down with 4 ministers about several issues that matter to Indigenous people. Stay tuned for that. And here's a look at tomorrow's weather in the east and the central parts of the country. To St. John's, we got -5 in snow, -6 in sunshine for Charlottetown. Happy Valley Goose Bay is clear skies, -13 degrees, -14 in Nain. Chibougamau, -4 in snow. Val d'Or, -1 in snow. North Bay, -1 in snow. 0 for Peterborough and Ottawa. Sunshine there. -4 in snow for Sioux Lookout, Kapuskasing, and Timmins. -2 in snow. -15 for Puckatawaga and clear skies. -10 for Norway House and God's Lake. -7 in sunshine for Winnipeg. -5 and snow for Brandon. -5 with a mix of sun and clouds for Saskatoon. -8 mix of sun and clouds for Yorkton. -10s for La Ronge and Buffalo Narrows. Clear skies. -16 in Stony Rapids with a mix of sun and cloud. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet ministers have been meeting in Winnipeg this week. They're charting a course for where they want to take their minority government in the next few months to find out where things are at with some of the issues that matter to Indigenous people. APTN brought in a panel of ministers. Here is Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett, Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller, Northern Affairs Minister Dan Vandel, and Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to have 4 ministers sitting at the desk here. It's usually just Dennis Ward and I. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that matter, as we said, to Indigenous people. I'll start with you. Just the headline grabber right now is the conflict at Wet'suwet'en Nation. We've got hereditary chiefs and their supporters opposed to a pipeline going through their territory. You've got elected chief and council. Where do you stand on this? What's your position on it?
Well, I think it does speak to really how we want to go forward in the progress on self-determination, how we want communities to be able to determine their governance and determine how they as communities will take decisions. And so, I think that we still hope that the community will be able to find a way forward, and we're very supportive of that process where communities will be able to take decisions, and in this case, of course, the elected chiefs and council had supported the project through all of its due process, and therefore this is, it's unsettling, but it is. I think we hope the community will be able to
do you think
come to a decision?
It's something that the community has to sort out amongst itself, and that there's no role for the court to be issuing injunctions in this?
Well, I think that this is a process that, in terms of the British Columbia government, a process that has been followed, and I think that and followed with the elected chiefs and councils. But it is about obviously there now is some members of the community who don't agree, and so we've got to figure out what you do when that happens. And I think it's going to be the community that has to be able to help chart a path forward, but it is about a BC process that was followed properly.
Okay. Mr. Miller, I want to talk to you about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, children who were victimized by the child welfare system over a long course of time here in Canada. When are you guys going to sit down and meet with all parties who are involved in this?
Well, that's an excellent question, and currently the parties are meeting, and this is why I've asked my Assistant Deputy Minister Valerie Demont to engage in a process to move forward and engage with the parties to see what the best process is for an adequate and fair compensation for children who have seen an incredible amount of victimization and harm occur to them. We are, as a government, do not contest compensation. We just want compensation to be effected in a fair and equitable way. Out of fairness to the process, and this is something that I've engaged as a minister with the Caring Society, with AFN, and the parties that we are negotiating with and discussing the issues with, including the class action parties, I've agreed to be confidential as to the back and forth of the discussions. These are very sensitive discussions. These are very painful discussions, but they need to be had, and they hadn't been had up until now. We face some deadlines, but we're focused on ensuring at all times that the children that were hurt are fairly and properly compensated.
Perfect. Mr. Vandel, you have Northern Affairs. This is the first time it's a standalone portfolio, I do believe.
That's right.
You've got a housing shortage. I think Nunavut needs $1.8 billion just to catch up.
Yes.
You've got a suicide crisis. Suicide rates are higher in the north than anywhere else. You've got food insecurity. You've got critics of a federal government food system that people say it's not working as it should. Where do you start with all of this?
It's an excellent question. Excuse me. And I think our government realizes that all those questions are so very important, and which is why we've created the first ever Minister of Northern Affairs, which I'm fortunate to have. Mm-hmm. And I think what we need to do, first of all, and I've already started this last week, is actually go up there and talk to the people who live in those communities. Last week I went to Whitehorse, I went to Yellowknife, mm-hmm. I was in Churchill. I spoke with chiefs, I spoke with community leaders, I had dinner with Premier Cochrane, met with Premier Silver, and some really good meetings. And all of those issues are so very important. Housing, climate change. Mm-hmm. Climate change is occurring 3 times faster in the north than it does in the south. So yeah. It's really the context underlying everything. If you see the infrastructure, the permafrost is melting, the infrastructure is, the foundations of buildings, of houses are buckling, which is a
But how do you possibly
issue.
Look at all of these things and
well,
have a plan to I think these are all massive issues alone.
I'm going to work with a whole bunch of other ministers, Minister Bennett for one on Inuit Nunangat policy, Minister of Infrastructure, Minister of Transportation, and we need a whole of government approach. That's apparent. It's not one minister that's going to make progress on all of these issues. Mm-hmm. Housing is a tremendously important issue. I've already met with Minister Hussein on possible solutions, working together. So we need a whole of government approach, mm-hmm. and that's going to be my direction moving forward. Mm-hmm. There's already been a lot of good work done with the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, which Minister Bennett led, mm-hmm. Which was co-developed with Indigenous nations, with provinces, with territories. Now the challenge is going to be to go from co-development to co-implementation. And that's really what I want to do, mm-hmm. build on the work that's been done and the commitments that have been made, and bring it to life. All of those issues mm-hmm. are incredibly important. That's why I'm here as Minister of Northern Affairs, first ever, but we need a whole of government approach to move forward on all of those issues we've talked about.
Minister Guilbeault, funding for Bill C-91. When are we going to know what the money is going to look like for the Indigenous languages?
Before I answer that, and I will, I'd just like to come back on something Dan just said, which is the fact that for our government, Indigenous issues is not the responsibility of 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 ministers, but it's a cabinet responsibility. Mm-hmm. Everybody is part of this. It's in everybody's mandate letter. There are only 2 things that are part of everybody's mandate letter: Indigenous issues and climate change. Because climate change shouldn't be just about the environment minister. It's a government responsibility. Big issues to tackle, a number of things that Dan has said, and some of the questions you were asking.
So what's your role in this? Obviously languages would be one. What's another? What are some of your other roles in this?
Well, I think we need to look at languages as something so much more than just languages. It's about culture. It's about heritage mm-hmm. in a very broad sense. It's about who we are, how we tell our stories to each other, how we dream of the future together. And the Indigenous Language Act is groundbreaking in the sense that without the implication of Indigenous people, this act would simply not exist. Mm-hmm. It was only made possible because of the heavy involvement of the Métis people, First Nations, and Inuit. It was adopted on the last day of Parliament in June of 2019. So we are looking at how we are going to implement this, and we want to do it very quickly. One of the first things we need to do is to put together a commissioner's bureau for the act, and we are actively working with our partners, Indigenous partners, to make this happen in the shortest possible amount of time.
Is there a dollar value that we can look for in the next budget?
Well, we've already committed more than $350 million for the implementation of the act and adequate ongoing funding afterwards. Now, what's the dollar figure on that? I can't tell you right now because the different Indigenous languages are in a very different state. So we have to figure out what is adequate for one community may not be for another. And one of the things we will be doing in the coming years is to figure that out. But it's in the law. We've put it in the law that we have to provide adequate funding. We decided that this is an obligation that we were putting on the federal government, and we want to deliver on it.
That's just the tip of the iceberg that we tackled with the Liberal ministers. If you want to watch the full 20-minute interview, you can do so online. It's at our website, aptnnews.ca. NHL play-by-play announcer Clarence Iron is our guest on Face to Face tonight. Iron, who called the very first Rogers hometown hockey in Cree on APTN, has since signed a 3-year deal with Rogers. The residential school survivor says he spoke to himself when he was young in an effort to retain his language.
Sounds crazy, but you know, if I was going to go buy something in a store, well, I'll speak to myself. Yeah, just like as if I'm talking to somebody. Atawagam gukto titan, doa tawitan, you know, like I speak to myself, and that's how I kept it alive. But in a residential school, I remember most of the students were losing their language. Yeah, most of them.
You won't want to miss that face-to-face right after this newscast. It's time for us to take another break, but when we come back, money is flowing to Manitoba as the province celebrates its 150th birthday. And here's the rest of tomorrow's weather forecast, this time for the west and the north. Starting off in northern Alberta, we got -9 for Fort Chip with mostly clear skies, 1 for Grand Prairie and sunshine, -2 in snow for Edmonton, 3 and rain for Calgary, 4 and rain for Penticton, 10 and rain for Vancouver, 9 for Victoria and Tofino and rain, -11 and a mix of sun and clouds in Dease Lake, -17 and clear in Fort Nelson, -24 in snow for Dawson City, sunny skies for Beaver Creek, -24. -20 for Wrigley and cloud skies, -20 for Fort Simpson and sunny. In Inuvik, -26 in snow, Sax Harbor, -23 and clear. Baker Lake, -35 and clear, Repulse Bay, -33 and clear. Tallyoak, -38, clear skies, Clyde River, -21 with a mix of sun and cloud, and Cape Dorset, -25 and clear. Welcome back. Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault and Minister of Northern Affairs Dan Van Dal were in Winnipeg this afternoon to announce some funding for Manitoba's 150th birthday. The ministers, along with Manitoba 150 Host Committee co-chair Stuart Murray, announced $700,000 for the celebration. The money will go towards a free concert in June and to raise awareness about Manitoba's entry into Confederation and the key role that the Métis Nation played in the province's history.
Manitoba 150 is also a fantastic opportunity to showcase everything that makes you proud to be Manitobans. The beautiful landscape, the heritage treasures, and the rich cultural traditions of your communities, whether Anglophone, Francophone, Métis, or First Nation. Friends, it is your party and your moment to share with all Canadians.
Well, that is your news for tonight. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great rest of your evening, and stay tuned now for Face to Face with Dennis Ward and the voice of Rogers hometown hockey in Cree, Clarence Iron.